So how do we use these in classifications? Well, as I said earlier, there are two systems of classification that we're going to talk about: the Henry system of fingerprint classification and the NCIC classification. So why do we have classifications? Well, just as certain features such as hair color, height, weight are used to generally describe an individual, a fingerprint classification is the description of an individual's fingerprints. With the use of a fingerprint classification, a fingerprint card can be filed, located, and retrieved in a manual fingerprint filing system. We can learn the formula used to code fingerprint cards for the purpose of filing and retrieval in a manual filing system. So to classify a fingerprint card using the Henry system, we're going to talk about first, and then we're going to learn how to do the NCIC classification system. As far as these systems go, in the United States and in most English-speaking countries, the Henry system of classification was used for most of the 20th century. It was named again after Sir Edward Henry of England. He developed the system during the late 1800s and early 1900s. The NCIC classification system is in use in the United States and is the National Crime Information Center, or NCIC, classification system. NCIC is a computerized database that allows law enforcement agencies nationwide to access, among other things, wanted bulletins and warrants for outstanding suspects and fugitives. The NCIC system was developed and used as a shortcut to the Henry system so that an individual suspected of being a subject of a warrant or warrant could be eliminated quickly. If it was determined that the subject matched the NCIC classification, then further information or investigation would be required, including a full fingerprint search. Now, both classification systems are based on the classification of all 10 fingers. Now, keep in mind, fingerprint classification is not the same as fingerprint identification. Classification uses class characteristics to group like fingerprints for the purpose of filing and retrieval. Many people will actually have the same fingerprint classification. On the other hand, fingerprint identification uses individual characteristics to individualize a print to a specific person. So let's look at these classifications. But to be able to do this classification, we need to know the different pattern types. We've covered that, and how things like ridge counts, whorl tracings, and primaries are determined. So we're going to cover that. So let's talk about the fingerprint card and how we do the classification. And I'm going to kind of take a little side note here and talk about blocking out a fingerprint card. And then we'll see actually how we do it, how we do the classification. I really like the technique of blocking out a fingerprint card because it helps us to then do our classification. You could look at a card and do the classification, but when you block out the card, it makes it a lot simpler to then transfer your blockout information to the classification. So here is what a fingerprint card looks like before it's blocked out. And I have some drawings here, very simplified, obviously, of fingerprint patterns in the 10 positions. Now, when you look at a fingerprint card, notice that the top row here, those are all the right hand. It's probably hard to see, and I've got other illustrations that we'll come to that it'll be a little easier to see, but it's labeled. In this box down here, it says number 1. So we call that finger 1, even though it's a thumb, we call it finger number 1, right thumb. And then box number 2, we call this finger number 2, right index, 3, right middle, 4, right ring, 5, right little. Then you go to the next row, and that's the left hand. So number 6 is the left thumb, number 7, left index, 8, left middle, 9, left ring, and 10, left little. All right, so that is where the fingerprints go when the fingerprints are captured, either through live scan or through actual ink rolling, which doesn't happen much anymore. All right. By the way, on this card, it has a place for the person's name, date of birth, description, place of birth, our ID numbers. And then this is where the classification is going to go. We'll see that in a moment, the Henry classification. And this is where the NCIC classification goes. All right, so we'll get to that. But then also on this card is down here is where 4 fingers are done simultaneously. So the left 4 fingers are placed right there on the card. And then the left thumb, the right thumb, and the right 4 fingers. Now, why do they have that there? Well, it gives us a little more information. Sometimes if something's not clear up here, you can find it down there, or it would actually be over here. But also, it's kind of nice because I've actually seen cards where someone has put all the left fingers on the top row and the right fingers on the second row. But when you look at the simultaneous impressions of the left hand and right hand, you can tell if it's left and right because you'll see the small finger and you'll see the index finger over here. And yeah, that's the left hand. And then you look up here and go, well, that's not this row, that's this row. So that's why those are there. Plus, they give a little more information. Plus, you can also see a little bit of the area below the fingertip, which can be very helpful if you don't have a palm print to go with, and you have some ridge detail there. Okay, anyway, so let's now look at the blocking out. When you block out a card, you actually write on here your findings. So this is a central pocket whorl. I put a W there because it's a whorl. We can see that. It's a central pocket whorl, and it has an inner tracing. And then this is a left sloping here, and there's a trace of 4. All right. And then on this one, we have left slope, and it's a loop, and it has a tracing of 6. And then this is a plain whorl with a meet tracing. And this is a plain whorl with a meet tracing as well. And these are all loops. So you do that, and what we'll see later is it makes your classification a lot easier to transfer. Let's look at how we actually do the classification here. The first step of the classification on a set of ink fingerprints is to determine the pattern type in each finger block. At the middle or right side of the bottom of each finger box on the fingerprint card, you indicate the pattern by using these symbols. If it's a plain arch, you use an A. If it's a tinted arch, you use a T. If it's an ulnar loop, you use the angle, like a, what do you call that? That angle in the direction of the loop. If it's a radial loop, you use an R. Okay, so it depends on which hand it's on, right? Which direction it's going. If it's a radial loop, use an R. And if it's a whorl, you use a W. Ulnar loops have the diagonal line. That's what I was looking for, diagonal. Slanting in the direction of the loop. You also then put the ridge count in the top right corner of the finger box. For whorl patterns, you indicate the type of whorl using the P for plain, C for central pocket, and a small d for the double loop, an X for an accidental loop, and you do that in the upper right corner of the finger box. Then you place the tracing, I, M, or O, inner, meet, or outer, next to the letter designating the type of the whorl. in the top right corner of the box. I'll show you this in a moment. This process of indicating the pattern type, the patterns, the ridge counts for loops, the world type, and all of that is referred to blocking out the card. So here we go. So if we look at this card a little more closely, 2, 3, and 4 are ulnar loops. All right. And because they have that left slope on the right hand. So we're going to make that diagonal for those. Let's see, 6, 7, and 8. Those are ulnar loops also because they're on the left hand and they are sloping to the right. All right, so you put a diagonal. Now, if one of these was sloping the other direction, you'd put an R, capital R. In number 1, this is a central pocket whirl. So we put the W there and the C up here. And then when we do our tracing, it's an inner. All right, so here's one delta, there's the other. And we can see when we trace, it's on the inside, 3 or more ridges. So we put an I there. Let's look at number 5. That's a plane whirl with a meeting tracing, right? So we do our tracing and it's going to meet. This is very simplified, but then it would have P for a plane whirl. This is central pocket because you have the deltas like that. We draw the line, remember? This one's a plane whirl and the deltas are more evenly spaced like this. Here we have one delta up really close. That's a tip off for a central pocket whirl. Anyway, this would be a meeting trace. All right. And number 2 here, this is an ulnar left slanting loop, and it has a ridge count of 4. So we count the ridges between here and there, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's a count of 4. So that's how you would block out a card. So in the Henry classification of fingerprints, we classify with 3 things: the type of pattern, whether it's arch, loop, or whirl, the finger position in which the pattern appears, the finger in which the pattern appears, all right, the position on the card, and the size of the pattern. This is really, this is the technical size and not the physical size. You know, and as far as physical size, the pattern is going to be the same from birth until you're an adult. When you're an infant or a child, your fingerprints are small because your fingers are small. When you're an adult, your fingers are larger, but it's the same pattern. That's not the size we're talking about. We're talking about the technical size, like the ridge count. All right. So we have the type of pattern, whether it's arch, loop, or whirl, the position, which finger it is, and the size of the pattern, as in the tracing or the ridge count. There are 3 basic pattern types, which are divided into 8 types, subdivision, and so for classification. So we have our loops that we divide into ulnar and radial. We've already showed you that. The arch, which is plain and tented, are the 2 classifications there. And then the whirl, and you can have a plain, a central pocket loop, a double loop whirl, or an accidental whirl. When we do the classification, there is the primary classification, then there's a secondary classification, and then there's further classification. For our purposes, we're only going to look at the primary and the secondary, including small letters. We're not going to go any further than that. All right. So let's look at the primary. Now here's where we start the classification. We've already blocked out our card. Now we can do our primary classification. And the primary is involved with the whorl patterns only. All right. So the primary is a fraction-like number, which expresses a whorl pattern combination in the 10 fingers appearing on the fingerprint card. Each of the whorls is assigned a value depending on which finger it appears. So if the whorl pattern, when you're looking at your card and you look at the whorl patterns, if you have a whorl pattern on the right thumb or the right index, the number 1 or number 2 position, those whorls each get 16 points, all right? Or a value of 16. If the whorls are on the 3 or 4 position, the right middle or right ring, then they get a value of 8 points each. If they're on the right small finger, number 5, or the left thumb, they get 4 points. If they're on the left index, number 7, or the left middle, number 8, they get 2 points. And if they're on the left ring, number 9, or the left little finger, number 10, they get 1 point each. To obtain the primary, you locate the whorls, if there are any. Sometimes you end up with a card where there's no whorls at all on the card. All right, we'll get to that too. And in the even numbers, okay, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10, if there are any whorls, you give them their value and you add the values and you come up with a number for the even numbered whorls. So let's say that you have a whorl in number 4 and number 10. So if you have a whorl in number 4, that would be 8. And you have a whorl in number 10, that would be 1. So you add the 2, 8 plus 1 equals 9. But wait, you always then add an arbitrary figure of 1 to it. You always add a 1, okay? So using the even numbered whorls on your card, you now have a count of 10, right? Because you have 8 and 1 equals 9. You add 1 more, now you have 10. That is your top number on this classification. I'll show it to you in a second, all right? Then, or that's your numerator, okay? Below that on the line is your denominator, and that's determined by calculating the whorl values on the odd numbered fingers. 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9. You do it the same way you did the even numbers, but now you're just doing the odd numbers. You always add 1 to whatever the total number is. All right, so when you have done that, you end up with a number over another number. Now let's say there's no whorls at all. What do you have then? Well, you have 1 over 1, because you always add 1 to your result. No whorls on the even numbers for the denominator, it's a 1, because you have 0 plus 1. No whorls on the odd numbers, that would be 1, because you have 0 plus 1. All right, so let's see how that would work. Let's say that there are whorls in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 8. First, you would calculate the values on 2 and 8, because those are our even numbers, right? So for 2, that's a 16. For number 8, you get a value of 2, going back to that chart we had. So 16 plus 2 is 18, plus the arbitrary figure of 1 gives you 19. That's your numerator. Now you're going to calculate the values of the odd numbers. 1, 3, and 7 are our odd numbers that do have whorls. This person's got a lot of whorls. All right. So number 1, that gives you 16 points. or a count of 16. A 3, in the 3 position, a whorl gives 8, a count of 8. And for number 7, it's a count of 2. So 16 plus 8 plus 2 equals 26. Plus you add the 1, now it's 27. So your primary is 19 over 27. That's how we get our primary. It's just the whorls. You add up the values of the even across the top for the top number, the odd for the bottom number, and you always add 1. All right. Now it's possible to have 1 over 1, which means there's no whorls. Or you could end up with 32 over 32 if the entire card is whorls. If all 10 fingers are whorls, it would be 32 over 32. All right, so that's the primary. Now we need to go to the secondary on our number. We are now finished with the odd and even numbered fingers. From now on, everything in the right hand goes above the line, our numerator, and everything from the left hand goes below the line, the denominator. So instead of even and odd, we're now using right and left for the numerator and denominator. The secondary is determined by observing what type of patterns appear in the right and left index fingers. The right and left index fingers. These pattern types are represented by the uppercase or lowercase capital letters as follows. If it's an ulnar loop, it becomes a U. If it's a radial loop, it becomes an R. If it's a plain arch, it's an A. If it's a tented arch, it's a T. If it's any kind of whorl, it's a W. Now remember, this is the right and left index finger only. This is, down here is what our classification is going to start looking like. We have 1 over 1, meaning there's no whorls at all, right? And we can also see that the right index finger, right is on the top, is an ulnar loop. We also see that below that line, that's going to be our left index finger, is a tented arch. So now we have the beginnings of our secondary. So that's our primary and our secondary. Secondary again is what is the index finger on the right hand and the index finger on the left hand. Pretty straightforward. If it's an R, it's going to be a radial loop. If it's a T, it's a tented arch. An A, it's a plain arch. Then we complete the part of this, well, we complete the secondary with small letters. The small letters, all right. This is the last thing we're going to cover in the formula. There really are more parts that we're not covering, but what this part is called is the small letters. These are the plain and tented arches and radial loops only. All right, plain and tented arches and radial loops only. These are considered part of the secondary. After the primary is calculated and the secondary is brought up to this, in the classification line, we're then going to look for any plain arches, tented arches, or radial loops in the fingers other than the right and left index. So we're ignoring the right and left index. We're looking at the other fingers, including the thumbs. And we are looking for plain arches, tented arches, or radial loops. We don't look for ulnar loops. These patterns are then are going to be indicated by small letters for these fingers. Okay, and the way we do it is we use a small A for a plain arch, a small T for a tented arch, and a small R for a radial loop. Okay, well, let's see how that works. So all the small letters of the right hand are on the top line, the numerator. And all of the small letters for the left hand will be below the line, the denominator. If, for instance, a plain arch appeared in the right middle finger, that's this one right here, and that's what we have here, a plain arch. We would then show directly to the right of the index finger part of the formula on the top line here, we would show a small a, indicating that position number 3 is an arch. We look and we see we don't have any others that qualify. So let's look at the example here. For our primary, we have 17 over 17. That's because number 2 is a whorl. And so if it's in the number 2 position, it gets 16 points. There are no other even numbered whorls. So it's 16 plus 1 equals 17. Now we go to number 1 on the odd side. Number 1 is a whorl. So there's no other odd number whorls. So that gets a value of 16. Remember, these two get 16 each. So 16 plus 1, don't forget to add that 1. And we now have 17 for our denominator. All right, so 17 over 17. If you just saw 17 over 17, you would know that there's 2 whorls on the number 1 and number 2, because that's the only way you could get 17. All right. Then for our secondary, the right hand is the numerator and the left hand is the denominator. And we only look at the index fingers. All right. So number 2 is a whorl. And because that's the right hand, it goes up here. So we have a W. All right. Now we look at the other index finger, the left hand. We decide what it is. Well, this is a radial loop. So we put an R right there. Then for the small letters, we are looking for plain and tinted arches. We're also looking for radial loops. But we don't count those if they're in the index fingers. We skip the index fingers because we already put our index fingers here. All right. Well, the only thing that qualifies of those is the plain arch that happens to be in the middle finger of the right hand. So we put an A following the W. Small letters for the right hand go up. Small letters for the left hand are below the line. That's how we do it. Now let's look at one other here. Now let's say you have some of these small letters that are not right next to the index finger. Well, we put dashes where there are other fingers. Now you don't have to put any dashes if there's nothing there. If you don't have anything over here, you don't have to put any dashes. There's just if you have like a radial loop that is on the little finger, you're going to put the 2 dashes there. All right, so looking at this one, you can determine that number 1 and number 4 fingers are whorls, because that's the only way you can end up with 9 over 17. All right, so we have 9 over 17. Those are our whorls. We then look at our index fingers, and they are both ulnar loops. So you put the U's, okay? And then as we look for the small letters, we find that we have a loop on the little finger that's a radial loop. It's the number 5. So what we do is we put the 2 dashes and then the R. Then we have another one of these small letter to put down on the left hand, so it goes below, and it happens to be the ring finger. So we put an A there because it's an arch, a plain arch. But because there's nothing here that we count, we have to put a little dash. All right. So now you can see how blocking out could actually be helpful, because you have all these things already on here. So when I get a card, I would just sit down and just immediately block out the card. Central pocket whirl with inner tracing. Plain whirl with a meat tracing. Ulnar loops and the counts. And you then, when you go to put your classification up here, it becomes very simple to do that. Now, the next thing we're going to do is that is the Henry system. This will be a little bit quicker and easier once we have everything blocked out. To then put in the classification for NCIC is pretty simple.